Hey everybody, it's Jason Sheftel here, and today we're going to talk about something pretty fun no one's probably heard all that much about, but it is about a shadowy prison system in China that's not even quite prisons. So let's get right into it. And what we're really talking about here is, well, what you could call it is a Chinese residential detention system. So, what this is, it's part of a large, shadowy network of things and systems in China that help make people disappear, along with people's money and their contacts on the internet, their presence online, their financial reality. Everything can sort of just disappear in China, right? Back in the Soviet Union, there was the whole Gulag archipelago where people would sort of disappear into labor camps. And while there is a labor camp type thing in Xinjiang, that isn't where Chinese people in particular or foreigners get sent. What you often get instead is just, well, residential detention. So what this means is you don't end up always in a prison. You don't end up in any sort of official facility. What you end up in is just in a random small bare room with no windows, no nothing, maybe no light, whatever, but it's almost just like a very small Chinese apartment room or apartment. And the truth is, that is really what it is. So this kind of surfaced when a couple Canadian journalists got sent into this basically apartment prison system. And what really happened, well, these were journalists who they kind of got caught in the massive scuffle between the US and China over the CFO of Huawei, who was basically detained by Canadian authorities on for U.S. reasons in Canada to try and get her extradited to the United States for breaking U.S. sanctions against Iran or whatever. So all sorts of Chinese companies are involved in doing business with people and places and things that the United States doesn't like. And typically, this kind of gets thrown under the rug, and the Chinese get the business, and the Americans don't make a big fuss about it. But starting with the Trump administration, that kind of changed. It was part of a broader campaign to sort of target China in various ways. And what happened to Canada after this was really difficult. Canada's kind of de facto ally of the United States. Don't have much choice when you're sitting above the United States and you're much smaller and you have no other neighbors, and you basically have to go along with what your bigger neighbor down south is up to. Well, the problem for Canadians in China turned out to be that China retaliated against them, and a couple prominent Canadian journalists were basically taken captive, just like the Huawei CFO was. So they were eventually released, along with sort of the CFO, as sort of tensions over this issue really stagnated. What really happened is basically, you can check out a video I did about Huawei after sanctions, but what basically happened is that Huawei is on the way out in a lot of the really cutting edge markets in the West, right? So the smartphone business has been decimated for Huawei. The 5G telecom equipment infrastructure business is basically being ceded in a lot of the countries that the US cares about to the very fortunate European companies of Nokia and Ericsson. And, right, so it's becoming much less of a problem, and it's also, quite simply, there's so many Chinese companies to target that, you could have targeted ZTE earlier, and Trump actually did, but then he kind of pulled back because he didn't want to kill it. And there's a similar thing. It's like, are you going to just kill all these companies? What are you going to do? What's the plan here? Well, when the tensions declined, the Canadian journalists were released, and they started telling their stories about this system where they're basically kept in a cell for months or years. They don't talk to anyone. They don't see anyone. There's obviously cameras. They're being monitored, but they have no idea what's going on. And this is a system that is used to hit tens and tens of thousands of people in China, particularly anyone, political figures, you could say, activists, human rights type people, anyone advocating for things in a way or on a subject that the Communist Party just doesn't like. And this is getting to become a bigger and bigger issue, and it's really a big deal when Western people get hit with it, because it's showing what can happen to people who go to China. So me personally, I haven't been to China in a long time, and I probably won't go for a long time unless I go to Taiwan, because all the things that I say when they're actually looked at do not really fit with what the Communist Party wants to hear. So it isn't a good thing to do. So for years, there's been exit bans in China, which can just prevent people from leaving. It's like, oh, thanks for coming, now you can't leave. that's happened for a long time. And again, it tends to happen to citizens of countries that, well, aren't the United States, right? So countries that China can get leverage over, that can't really bully it or threaten it or do things that the United States does. This is a disturbingly common thing. And the key thing to really know about this whole system is that it is part of the name of the game, right? What's going on here is that China doesn't have a legal system, a real legal system in any way that the West would understand. So I'm, among other things, a lawyer by training, and the legal systems of the world can basically be broken into two types of systems. This is a little bit far afield, but it's actually useful to know. And what you actually get are basically, we call it common law and civil law, kind of you go online, you look at it, but really what we're talking about here is basically a sort of community law versus imperial law situation. So if you go look at where the great civil law systems of the world came about, it'll be like, oh, we pulled up, well, it'll be like, oh, Rome created this law system, or the Qin dynasty created this big law system, or pick your ancient dynasty, the random Persian dynasties, old Mesopotamian dynasties, they created big legal systems. And in more modern times, you have a lot of European nations, they dug up tablets from in Italy and created a civil law, or Napoleon brought the civil law to multiple nations and the French at gunpoint. These sorts of things are what you really see. And then the actual common law is actually quite different. It sort of is more of a ground up from the community through the medium of the judge sort of system, whatever the merits and demerits of it. It isn't imposed top down, or at least that was originally how it went. Now all these systems are much more intermixed, and you can't even really describe them in this broad speaking fashion I just did, but for historical note, for historical perspective, it's actually very useful. And in China, what you have is imperial law through and through, without any of the other things that have been developed primarily in these common law countries to show some acknowledgement, appreciation, understanding of individual liberty, civil rights, any of that kind of stuff. So basically, there's no adversarial criminal law system that's real. When you go look at Chinese political figures that are taken out, it's just a massive sham show trial to basically do a whole theater of sin and repentance and guilt and all of this. It is much more of a theatrical thing. So when you get hit in China with these things, you're lost. There's not really anybody or anything that can come help you. And the norms, like all the things that we talk about, when we talk about law and rights and all this stuff, it just doesn't apply in the way people think. It's so deep-rooted that people really don't understand. Basically, the Communist Party is the law, and the legal system is just there to kind of make things easier. A lot of laws in China are just things that are on the books, and there's thousands of them. They're in the civil law style of massive codes and compendiums and stuff, but it's used at the discretion, the pleasure, the interest, the need of the prevailing political authority, right? So if you're a current tech company and you're doing something the Communist Party doesn't like, you get hit with the entire book. If you're a company that's doing something that the party does like, you have no problems, right? So it is corrupt, is one way to think about it from root to tip, but the other way to think about it is that it's not even appropriate to use the terminology that we use. And this is where it gets really difficult for people, because China has been trying to create the impression that this is very much like Western systems, but it is just not. And I mean, this goes even to the property system, where in China you don't really have, like in the US we call it freehold property. We call it actual private property, where if you own some piece of land, you own it and it's not possessed by the government. In China, you technically have leases from the Communist Party, more or less. That is what you have. You have 99-year leases or whatever it is for all these land, and you have a land market, a tertiary land market, like not the actual primary ownership of the market. You don't actually buy the ownership, you buy the rights to use it, and you have that market was created to function kind of like, or sufficiently like, or enough like a real property market for things to kind of function in a modern way. And China did this in the 90s when it was developing, but you go actually down to the bottom of it and you realize this is even the most basic thing like property, all the amazing cities, all the amazing things that were built in China, they're not even quite using the same framework that people in the West are even able to kind of verbalize, right? And there are other things in the West that are very different between countries. For example, the CEO of what we call the CEO of Volkswagen isn't quite exactly known as a CEO. It's sort of like the board of the managers and workers or whatever. It's actually a different thing, but we cover over all of these very specific differences between countries that emerges out of their geographies and specific political economies and histories, and we make it all more easy to understand by using all the same labels. And this basically happens because of journalism, which is trying to make everything easy to understand, or at least trying to present people with information that is sufficiently simple that it can be digested. And in the process, we lose basically everything that we would need to actually understand things at their core. And that's a real problem. People who are interested should check out some of the other stuff I'm doing, particularly a coming course and some other videos on that sort of issue. But getting back to this residential detention, this is a different region with a very different politics, and here's the really horrific thing, is that all this property we're talking about in China, all the giant cities, all the apartment complexes, all this stuff, and all the possible empty apartments, all the vacant apartments, all of this, well, if it's just owned by the Communist Party in the end, you could just use whichever piece of it to basically create a vast, mass distributed prison system across all cities, counties, everywhere, and you just use the property, the residential property, as just, filling all these cities. It's actually kind of a creepy, smart thing. This is one of those creepy, smart surveillance, monitoring, population control things that China is just bringing to the next level as things spiral in that country. And this is one of them. Well, here's what it really means when you need the capacity to imprison mass amounts of people. Well, you could just imprison them in their own homes and apartments. And that's actually what you saw a lot during lockdowns. You actually just saw people functionally just imprisoned in their homes and not imprisoned with quotes and stuff like you had in the West, which was a horrific, challenging experience for Western democracies and sort of the balance between public health and collective safety and the individual liberties. All this has been a real difficult challenge that various countries have solved or not resolved or not even gotten a handle on at all in various ways. In China, you didn't really have this problem because, well, you just lock the imperial subjects in their cities, right? And so right now you have mass lockdowns of entire cities in China. It's the exact same thing, right? You can lock down a single person, you can lock down an apartment building, an apartment block, subsidy, a neighborhood, or an entire city, right? Or entire regions, right? This is exactly what real population control looks like. And people who wanted to get a quick sense of where this comes from, just think about residential detention. The idea that there are people in China, they get sent, or people who go to China, such as foreigners who are saying the wrong thing, and you just get thrown into some random apartment in some random industrial city somewhere, right? And no one knows, and you don't actually get any sort of recourse or help or anything. That is the way things are right now. That's where things are trending, unfortunately. So this is another area where the kind of horrific tech authoritarianism is coming into play, right? So you monitor all these people. You have rooms where it shows exactly what people are doing. You can use surveillance and camera technology, so you don't even have to have like someone looking at a camera of the person. You can just have a readout that shows that their vitals are okay, they've moved X feet for this amount of time. You don't even have to have the person be a person. They can just be part of a vast database or dashboard that shows you what the various prisoners all across the detention system are actually doing. So on that really cheery note, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, learned a bit of something about how countries are different, how China is not trending in the best direction if you're looking at anything related to individual rights or liberties, if that wasn't obvious. And if you enjoyed the video, please like it so more people can see it. If you've seen a couple of these videos and you like them, consider subscribing and hit the notification button so you don't miss any other future content. And with that, I'm Jason Sheftel, and I'll see you next time.